Today on the AT podcast, my guest is the world famous best-selling author, criminal law attorney, and law professor, Alan Dershowitz. We had a freewheeling conversation, covered a lot of topics, but the spine of our talk was the differences between Talmudic law and American law in capital cases, right? Where there's a homicide and the defendant it could be subject to the death penalty. The requirements for such a trial are very different in a rabbinic court where there was no jury, nor prosecutor, nor defense attorney, where everything was done by the judges, as contrasted with the American system. So we came in and out of the Mishnah, a passage in the Talmud, where the judges would literally intimidate the witnesses in a rabbinic court to make sure they understood the gravitas of the testimony they were offering in a capital case. And this led to the famous passage of one who saves a life, it's as if he saved a world. And so we kept coming back to this passage with Professor Dershowitz. We also touched on Israel advocacy, identity politics, and its impact on education in the college system and even in high schools. And a bunch of other topics, including Professor Dershowitz's origin tale in a Brooklyn yeshiva. I know you're going to enjoy it.
Accidental Talmudist wisdom you don't want to miss. Now my pal Sal, take it away.
All right, welcome everybody. We'll give people a little bit of a chance to find the broadcast. We can just make a little small talk. Welcome, Professor Dershowitz. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. How are you?
Thank God. Thank God. We're actually having our first rain of the season here in Los Angeles, and that's always a welcome change.
Well, we're up in Massachusetts where it rains and snows, but we love it here.
I believe the old saying about Boston is if you don't like the weather, just wait a minute. All right. And now let me just double check. Okay, that the audience is growing. Okay, here we go. Very good. It is definitely on the air. All right, so let us get started. I think we're going to have a fun time today. Professor Dershowitz is on air a lot. I mean, he's just consulted constantly in American jurisprudence and other matters on lots of media. So I wanted to make our interview today just a little bit different. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the difference in capital law cases between Talmudic law and American law, among other topics. So let me just start with an introduction here. Professor Alan Dershowitz is the world's best known criminal lawyer, the author of multiple bestsellers, and an emeritus professor at Harvard Law School, where he taught for 50 years. He is a U.S. constitutional law scholar and prominent advocate of civil liberties. Half of his cases are pro bono to serve indigent clients. He is also a proud Jew and Zionist, and I look forward to some deep Talmudic conversation. Welcome, Professor Dershowitz.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your spectacularly named show.
I am an accidental Talmudist. I don't claim to be in the ranks of proper Talmudists at all,
Well, I
but I
learned
am invested.
the Talmud for 12 years in yeshiva, and I wasn't a particularly great student in the Talmud, but I loved the Talmud and actually took classes in the Talmud while I was teaching at Harvard. So I love the Jewish heritage. I love studying the Torah and the Talmud and the Mishnah. So let's go.
Let's go. Well, let's just start a little bit with the background. You grew up in Brooklyn and attended Yeshiva Eitz Chaim, is that right?
Yeah, Borough Park. I was born in Williamsburg. My parents moved to Borough Park when I was young, and I went to Eitz Chaim Yeshiva and also Torah Semes Yeshiva, in which we learned Yiddish. And then I went on to Brooklyn Talmudic Academy, where there were 56 people in the class. I had a very distinguished career. I think I finished, of the 56, I think I finished 48th in the class. And I remember getting a grade once, a Benoni minus, which in Hebrew The Hebrew is mediocre minus. And the teacher told me, you had something to aspire to. You can aspire to mediocrity. I did not. And my principal called me in one day and said, Dershowitz, you got a good mouth on you, but a Yiddish cup, a good brain you don't have. So you should figure out something that you use your mouth a lot, but not your head. He said, I have two suggestions. Remember, this is an Orthodox rabbi. He said, first, you could be a conservative rabbi, the greatest insult he could hurl at anybody. And second, that if you can't be a conservative rabbi, maybe you could be a lawyer. So I wasn't smart enough to be a rabbi. I became a lawyer. And I never got a B in my life. I went straight from C's in high school to straight A's in college and law school. Never a B.
Did you find that college was easier than yeshiva, or just more interesting?
Just more interesting. Just opened my mind. It was easier in some respects. High school, I went from 8:10 in the morning to 6:10 at night. And then I played basketball on the varsity basketball team. I guarded a kid named Ralphie Lipschitz in Madison Square Garden. He changed his name. I don't know why, but he's now Ralph Lauren. And he wasn't a great basketball player, but he really dressed well. And so, I went to yeshiva for 12, 13 years, and then went on to secular college and law school.
And so you went to Yale Law School, is that right?
Yeah.
And then did you begin your teaching career immediately after the clerkship at the Supreme Court?
I did. I was offered a job with Bobby Kennedy, who was then Attorney General, to be a special assistant. But Harvard offered me a job. How could I say no? Harvard, when I grew up, Jews couldn't get into Harvard. As a student, you couldn't get into Harvard. They were offering me an assistant professorship at age 25. So I said yes, and I stayed there for 50 years.
Never left. Couldn't get rid of you. You like the weather, you like the streets, you like the food in Cambridge.
I taught at Stanford. I went to NYU. I taught at Hebrew University. I did some seminars at Yale, but mostly for the 50 years, it was Harvard, 10,000 students. Many of them I'm still in touch with.
Well, then let me just share a little story. My first interaction with you, it wasn't really an interaction, but the first time I was in a room with you. So I was an undergrad at Harvard, and this must have been about 1986. My friend Matt Stasier, we were on the rowing team together, and he was always, he had a nose for doing something interesting. And he said, Dershowitz teaches here. Are we going to spend 4 years here and never visit his class? Let's go visit his class. So we went to visit your class. I think you were teaching probably second year constitutional law, something like that. And you were talking about capital cases that day, and specifically the case that you defended the defendants in, which I believe was two boys, or I guess they're adults, but they sprung their father from prison, and murders were committed in the course of that.
17 and 18 years old when they broke their father out of prison. Their father and his cellmate then killed 5 people. The father was killed, and the 2 of them were sentenced to death, and I helped save their lives on death row, a pro bono case that I argued in the United States Supreme Court. And the key to my success, I think, is that I brought the classroom into the courtroom, and I brought the courtroom into the classroom. And you were there on a day when I was bringing the courtroom, the actual case, into the classroom, and having the students analyze the felony murder rule, the conspiracy rule. These kids never fired a shot. They were sent away by their father, who didn't want them to know he was going to kill the family. And yet they were held completely responsible and sentenced to death. So it was a very, very interesting issue.
It sure was. And what I remember that day is the way that I remember going down was you asked a student to advocate for the position that they should receive the death penalty. And so the students sort of stumbled through an answer why that would be the correct penalty. And then you argued the other side and made such a compelling case against the death penalty, not only in that case, but in all cases, that it just could never be applied fairly. There's racism inherent, et cetera. And I was sitting in the back and feeling emotionally in my heart that if the death penalty were ever applied in America, it would be a travesty of justice, and I really better do something about it when I leave the college cocoon and get involved. But then you asked a student to make the argument against the death penalty. Okay, so she gave the chapter headings of what you had just done. And then you argued the other side in favor of the death penalty, in this case, so compellingly that I was sitting in the back with my heart tugging, like, if we don't have a death penalty, the American justice system is going to fall in the toilet.
Yeah. Well, today you couldn't do that. Today you couldn't do that. You cannot teach politically incorrect points in class today, or you will get suspended, fired, terrible numbers and reviews. And so teachers today are not teaching the way I taught for 50 years. They are simply giving the students what they want to hear. And the popular teachers are the one who the students shake their heads and say, wow, that's just what I want to hear. I want to hear this. This makes me feel good. I could get massage therapy. It would make me feel good, or I can go to class and make me feel good. That's not the job of a teacher. The job of a teacher is to make you feel conflicted, to make you understand that there are multiple ways of looking at problems. You can't do that today. You cannot do that today at universities. You will be skewered. Education is dying. The Socratic method is dead. The Talmudic method is dead. What is the Talmudic method? Every side of every argument is presented, and you have to thoroughly analyze both sides. Not today, not on American university campuses. Today, you give the students what they want to hear. And if you dream of doing anything different, what happens to you is what happened to Ron Sullivan. Ron Sullivan, this great guy, great lawyer, great advocate, professor of law, was also the dean of Winthrop House. They used to call him the master, the first African-American couple to be the deans of a college at Harvard. And he got fired. He got fired because he represented Harvey Weinstein for about a month. And there was no problem when he represented somebody charged with double murders. Hernandez, the end from the Boston New England Patriots, who was convicted, ultimately committed suicide, convicted of two brutal first-degree gangland type murders. That was not a problem for the students at Winthrop House. But these snowflakes, they're not snowflakes. That's an insult to snow. These bullies with the loud mouths, they look at their professors and they lie through their teeth. They say, I feel unsafe. I feel unsafe in the presence of Ron Sullivan. That's a lie. You can't feel unsafe in the presence of a distinguished law professor and his wife just because he happens to be representing somebody you don't like, even though you weren't unsafe when he represented two people in gangland type murders. Why we believe these liars, just because they're students and because they're the ones in the class, they're liars. They're not telling the truth. They're using, I feel unsafe, as an excuse for censorship. It's the latest.
Is a disaster for American education. It's a disaster.
It's a disaster. And, as I said to you before, I have a new book out. It's called Cancel Culture, the newest attack on free speech and due process. And it's all about that. It's all about how you cannot teach in college today or in universities. And it's getting to be high schools as well. Look at Dalton. Dalton, which is a great high school in New York, used to be a great high school in New York, now sent out a memo that everybody on their staff has to have particular points of view about racial issues. It's a litmus test. It's McCarthyism. Maybe McCarthyism for a good cause, but it's McCarthyism nonetheless. They have to take loyalty oaths. And if they won't take a loyalty oath, they can't teach it at Dalton. And they're going to abolish advanced courses. They've said that by 2013, unless African-American and other minority students do as well in advanced courses, they're going to have to abolish them and bring everybody down to the lowest common denominator where people don't have to compete and everybody is equal. The abolition of grades. I could never have gotten where I got if grades had been abolished. Who's going to hire a Jewish kid from Borough Park with Eastern European grandparents with no money and no yichus and nothing to support him unless he was first in the class or the top of the class? Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have been a secretary if not for grades. And yet so-called radicals and leftists want to abolish grades. There's now a movement to admit students to Harvard randomly without concern for grades, SATs, background. Sleep your way through high school and get a lucky number and get into Harvard. And then Harvard will have to reduce the academics down to the lowest common denominator. And, when that was proposed once at Harvard Law School, I said, fine, why don't you just admit anybody who wants to go to Harvard? You can have Harvard. We're going to start a new law school called Harvard, and we're going to take all your faculty away, and we're going to only admit the brightest kids in the country, and let's see who gets the good jobs out of law school, the kids from Harvard or the kids from Harvard. You can't, how many years will the name Harvard last if they lower the standards in the way they've been lowering the standards over the years?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, certainly what our sages have always taught is that God expects us to be able to draw and to understand distinctions. And it seems like this modern society is all about obfuscating distinctions, making a kind of just a gray homogeny of everything.
No, they want distinctions, but they want distinctions to be based on race, gender, sexual orientation. It's identity politics. It's very important. Distinctions are very important. If you're
the right distinction.
If you're pale, male, and Yale, shut up. We don't want to hear from you. But if you're a person of color, if you're gay, if you're Muslim, if you're Native American, and God bless them, I've supported all of these minorities in a quest for equality, but I reject identity politics. I'm with Martin Luther King. I want to see the time when my grandchildren or great-grandchildren are judged by the quality of their character, not by the color of their skin. But identity.
In other words, the answer to years of racism is not more racism. It's the end of racism.
Yeah, and it's not only racism. It's racism, it's sexism, it's everything-ism except meritocracy. Indeed, today, if you quote Martin Luther King's statement, you can be disciplined in some colleges. If you talk about meritocracy, meritocracy has now become a word to be avoided because meritocracy is perceived of as elevating certain people over others based on their merit. What could be worse than judging people based on their merit? Oh my God, what a sin we're all committing.
All right. I'm not going to say don't get me started. I'm not going to say don't get you started. We could go on that topic all night. But we're going to go in and out of this topic. But we are talking about capital cases. And the difference in the way capital cases are treated in a Beis Din, in a rabbinic court, particularly when the Sanhedrin existed at the time that the temple stood in ancient Israel, versus how it's handled in American law and American jurisprudence today. So what I thought we would actually do is look at a Mishnah. This is in Tractate Sanhedrin on page 37b, 37a, it begins. And it's a very famous Mishnah, and I thought we'd work our way through the Mishnah. But before we even get into the Mishnah, I'm just going to offer the very first commentary in the Gemara. So the rabbis of a little later period, this is this camera today, of a little later period commenting on the rulings of the earlier rabbis of the Mishnah. These are the rabbis in the Babylonian Jewish community talking about these earlier rabbis. And so they say in the Gemara on page 37b, Tractate Sanhedrin, the sages taught in a Baraisa. How does the court describe testimony that's based on conjecture? Conjecture is a kind of testimony we're not going to accept. And the court says to the witnesses, well, perhaps you saw this man about whom you are testifying pursuing another man into a ruin, and you pursued him, and you found a sword in his hand, dripping with blood, and the one who was ultimately killed was on the floor and twitching. If you saw only this, it is as if you saw nothing, and you cannot testify to the murder. Is this a rule that we actually do have in American law?
No, absolutely not. We allow circumstantial cases to be presented. That's a classic circumstantial case. The example that we always give in court is if you see somebody walking into the courthouse, dripping wet, holding an umbrella, you can assume he came in out of the rain. Now, it's of course possible that it's not raining outside and he walked past a burst pipe, but he happened to be carrying an umbrella because it rained yesterday and the burst pipe sprayed him with water. That's all possible. But, you know, when you hear hoofbeats and you see a tail and a head, it's more likely to be a horse than a zebra. So the law in America allows you to draw reasonable inferences from circumstantial facts. In some jurisdictions, I won the Von Bulow case on this theory, that if you're presenting circumstantial facts, it has to exclude the totality of the evidence has to exclude every reasonable inference of innocence. If a reasonable inference of innocence remains, a circumstantial case can't result in a conviction. Most courts reject that and say the circumstantial case is every bit as strong as an eyewitness case. And of course, eyewitness cases can be incredibly weak. Just the other day, a man was released from 38 years in prison, 38 years, on the basis of a woman who swore under oath that she saw him light the fire that killed somebody. And it turned out she made up the whole story. She was pressured into doing it by other people, but she made up the whole story. And eyewitness testimony can be deliberately false. It can be mistakenly false. And so all evidence is probabilistic. And so the Talmud is wrong when it imposes such restrictive limitations and accepts eyewitness testimony. Later science has demonstrated that eyewitness testimony can be as vulnerable to error as circumstantial cases.
Right. So what they were saying here is that they were only going to convict in a capital case and impose the death penalty if there were two witnesses who actually saw the event and not simply saw what looked like the result or the details of the event without seeing the event itself.
Torah says that al pi shnayim edim yamut hamet. I think I got the words right. On the basis of two witnesses shall the person be killed.
Right, and so only with two.
Torah, but the Torah doesn't specify what the witnesses had to see, and the Talmud and the Mishnah elaborate on that, and I think elaborate in it. Now, if you're dealing only with the death penalty, I can buy that. I can buy the death penalty should only be reserved for the most extreme cases. It shouldn't be allowed for eyewitness testimony either, unless it's corroborated. There should be massive corroboration required. I spent 37 minutes on the phone with the President of the United States, pleading with him not to allow the execution of a man, a 40-year-old man, who was convicted basically of being an accessory after the fact of murder. He had been in prison 22 years. He had rehabilitated himself, and I could not persuade the president to save his life. He gave me a full hearing, a full opportunity. I argued together with Ken Starr, and we argue that the death penalty should be reserved for only the most extreme cases. And this man, Brandon Bernard, was not that most extreme case. There's another case now of a woman who's about to be executed, I think on January 7th or 10th. I don't remember the exact date. She was nuts. She slit open a pregnant woman's belly, killed the woman, stole the baby. And she had a long history of mental illness, and they're about to execute her. So, look, I'm strongly opposed to the death penalty. You wouldn't know that from my classes because I always try to present both sides of the issue in the class. But in my private and public advocacy life, I'm a strong opponent to the death penalty.
Now, for our audience who may not be familiar, and a very big difference between the Sanhedrin or any rabbinic court and an American court is the presence of lawyers. So in the Talmudic times that we're talking about, or actually before that, when the court was constituted by these rabbis in Jerusalem, it was the judges who examined the witnesses, and there were no advocates as acting as prosecutors or defending attorneys. Would you like to comment on the advantage or disadvantage of such a system?
Well, I have to tell you, considering the kind of attorneys who represent people who are today on death row, you're probably better off with no attorney. I represented a guy some years ago, and his lawyer was a Klansman, a former Klansman named Piggy Parrish. The defendant was a black man who allegedly killed a white state trooper, and Piggy Parrish fell asleep during the cross-examination. And as I said in my brief, those few hours that he was asleep were his finest hours as a defense lawyer. During those 2 hours, he did no harm. When he was awake, he told the jury, "Why would you think that my client is telling the truth? I don't believe him. Why should you?" So, there are defense attorneys and there are defense attorneys. During the Sanhedrin period, there is something in the Talmud that says if there's a death penalty case and it unanimously results in a conviction without considering it overnight, there has to be a new trial because nobody advocated, obviously, articulately and zealously enough for the defendant. And so you need to have somebody advocating for the defendant, but whether he's a lawyer, she's a lawyer, or a member of the court, look, given a choice between having a lawyer on my side and having a judge on my side, I'll take the judge anytime.
Right. And a greater Sanhedrin in a capital case, I mean, it was 70 or 71 judges who were present. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about the Mishnah that circumstantial case was commenting on. The Mishnah says, how does the court intimidate the witnesses, right? So I think intimidating witnesses is not part of American jurisprudence.
I'm interested, what is the Hebrew or Aramaic word for intimidate? Is it?
Let's see. Ketzad? Is that a intimidate? Haidim aladei.
Telling what the exact word was, because intimidation.
Ketzad.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
It's Ketzad. So how does the court intimidate the witnesses in giving testimony for cases of capital law? They would bring the witnesses in and intimidate them by saying to them, perhaps what you say in your testimony is based on conjecture, or perhaps it is based on a rumor. Perhaps it is a testimony based on hearsay. For e.g., you heard a witness testify to this in a different court. Or perhaps it is based on the statement of a trusted person. Perhaps you do not know that ultimately we examine you with inquiry and interrogation. And if you are lying, your lie will be discovered.
Good. I wish they did that in America. There are so many lying witnesses in cases. There are so many people who commit perjury, and we don't go after perjurers. We don't go after people who lie. I'm involved in a case now where a woman I never met, never heard of, accused me of having sex with her when she was like 18 years old. I never heard of her. I never had sex with anybody other than my wife during the relevant time period. And she left behind emails saying she never met me, a book manuscript saying she never met me. Her lawyer on tape says she's wrong, simply wrong. It was impossible for me to have been with her. She told her best friend that she never met me, never had any contact with me, and she was pressured to falsely accuse me by her friends. Her other lawyer has said she's committed perjury, essentially, and nobody's going after her. No consequences. She just bought a home for $2 million in Australia based on money she earned from these kinds of accusations. Not for me, I wouldn't pay her a penny. But the American legal system encourages perjury in civil cases by almost never, ever holding people responsible or accountable. I'm asking prosecutors to indict this woman for perjury. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal saying, please investigate me, because when I testify and she testifies in our cases, one of us will be committing perjury. I will swear under oath I never met her, I never heard of her, I never knew her. She will swear under oath she had unprotected sex with me on 7 different occasions, with George Mitchell, with Ehud Barak, with Leslie Wexner, with Bill Richardson, with everybody in Jeffrey Epstein's Rolodex who she could find. She will falsely claim she had sex with. One of us will be lying, and I want to see a prosecution, but I doubt there'll be one.
Right. I mean, in the Talmudic system, if you step in as a false witness and that's proven, you're going to receive the penalty of what the defendant would have received had your testimony been accepted.
I have this other book called Guilt by Accusation, The Challenge of Proving Innocence in the Age of Me Too, which I lay out all the evidence. And I say, I want the Talmudic response. I want her to get the same penalty I would have gotten had her story been true. But it's part of political correctness. They won't go after her. She's a woman. Maybe she was victimized by Jeffrey Epstein. That doesn't give her the right to victimize me. I'm the victim here, and victims ought to speak out. And I've been speaking out because I have nothing to hide. But I would like to see the Talmudic system applied to her, but I doubt it will be.
Well, let's talk just for a moment. You mentioned Epstein, you mentioned von Bülow before. You've had clients in your career that the media and the public might deem, let's say, unpopular.
No doubt. That's my major criteria for taking cases. If nobody else will take them, I will take them because I had tenure at Harvard and I couldn't be fired. So I think I have a special responsibility for taking the most unpopular, the most hated, and people who most people think are guilty. That's the main criteria I have. If it's an easy case, let somebody else take it. If it's an impossible case, I want it.
So is that a positive feature of the American system, that somebody who is just, a heinous criminal could get the best defense from the best legal minds in the country?
I learned it from a guy named Abraham. He says to God, Chalila, Chalila lacha hashofet kol ha'olam lo ya'aseh mishpat. Chalila, far be it from you. You, the judge of all the world, will not do justice. He was defending the sinners of Saddam. If they deserved Abraham, surely O.J. Simpson deserved me, or other people need to have a zealous defense attorney. So I learned it from Abraham. I learned it from John Adams, who defended the soldiers who killed the innocent Bostonians during the Boston Massacre. I learned it from Abraham Lincoln. I learned it from Clarence Darrow, from Thurgood Marshall, from all those people who defended the guilty along with the innocent. And I'm just part of that long tradition.
Did you know Burt Newborn? Do you know Burt Newborn?
Of course I do. Yeah.
So I went to law school. I went to NYU. I was a lawyer briefly, and he was our constitutional law professor. And he talked about that moment that the ACLU faced when they were tasked to defend the Nazis who wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois.
Involved in that. I was on the board of the ACLU at the time, along with Burt. And there was opposition, and there was criticism. I have to tell you, though, the ACLU today is not your grandfather's ACLU. Yeah, they'll continue to represent a Nazi once a year to have credibility, but they won't go on college campuses. They won't take on the Me Too movement. They won't take on cancel culture. They won't take on political correctness. You can't count on the ACLU today. Unfortunately, there have to be new organizations, and there is a new organization called FIRE, F-I-R-E, Freedom of an Individual, I don't know what, on university campuses. They do a great job in standing up for politically incorrect students. The ACLU does not do a great job. They used to do it when Burt Newborn and I were on the board and other people were on the board, and then they became politically correct as well.
All right, let's continue our Mishnah. So the court tells them, you should know that in cases of capital law, you should know that cases of capital law are not like cases of monetary law. In cases of monetary law, a person who testifies falsely, causing money to be given to the wrong party, can give the money to the proper owner and his sin is atoned for. But in cases of capital law, if one testifies falsely, the blood of the accused and the blood of his offspring that he did not merit to produce are ascribed to the witness's testimony until eternity. It's permanent. Right? If we make a mistake in a capital case, it cannot be undone with money damages or any other process.
Well, I tell a story to juries as follows. There's a great Hasidic Rebbe who was known for never saying anything bad about anybody. And so his students, in order to challenge him, came and said, Rebbe, say something good about being an atheist. The Rebbe stopped and he thought for a moment and he said, there's a time in everybody's life that they should temporarily be an atheist. What? Yes. If you see a poor person hungry on the street, do not say God will save him. Act as if there is no God. Act as if you're the only person who can save that person. I tell that to the juries. And I teach it to my students, that story, because you have to tell the jurors, look, don't count on God. Don't count on heaven. Don't count on forgiveness. You are the only 12 people who stand between this man or woman and death row. And you are the only people responsible, and you can save his life if you have a reasonable doubt about innocence. And so it's so important that we create these institutional structures to prevent miscarriages of justice. Remember, both the Talmud, the Torah, and American jurisprudence under Blackstone say better 10 guilty go free than even one innocent be wrongly convicted. So when a potentially guilty person goes free, many people thought O.J. Simpson was guilty. I helped get him acquitted. That's part of our legal system. But when an innocent person is executed, as we've had in our country, that is not part of our legal system. And
as Barry Scheck has shown, a lot of innocent people have been convicted.
Well, we all know
but
about
for DNA.
One of them, Ethel Rosenberg. We now have categorical evidence that Julius Rosenberg was a spy, although he didn't steal the atomic secret. He was falsely convicted of that. He stole other secrets. But Ethel Rosenberg was not guilty. She was not part of it, and the government knew it. They just were using her as a hostage to try to get him to reveal who his other sources were within the communist spy network. Julius Rosenberg was a spy, and he had higher ups, and he could have incriminated them. and he allowed his wife and himself to die rather than incriminating higher ups because he was such a Fabrenta communist. He was such a devoted communist. But when they executed Ethel, they knew she was innocent. And they willfully and deliberately, they said they had to keep their promise, otherwise their deterrent value wouldn't carry forward. So that was one of the great scandals of American history. We've had other scandals as well. Look, Israel came close to executing somebody who it turned out wasn't guilty of the specific crime. Ivan the Terrible, I was at his trial. John Demjanjuk, he was convicted of being Ivan the Terrible of Sobibor, and it may have been that he was just Ivan the Very Bad, or just another terrible Ivan, but not the Ivan the Terrible. And the Supreme Court of Israel, including Holocaust survivors sitting on the court, reversed his conviction and sent him back to America, where he ultimately died. But it's always possible to make mistakes. I was opposed to the execution of Adolf Eichmann. Can you imagine a worse criminal in the history of the world than the man who killed, probably was personally responsible for 1 million of the 6 million deaths, mostly the Hungarian Jews who were living perfectly
including my grandfather.
Who were killed by Eichmann. And yet I was opposed to his death penalty. I didn't think I had standing because my family were not Hungarians, we're Polish Jews, and they had already died by the time Eichmann got deeply involved. But I think as a principle, the death penalty should not go forward. And in our lifetime, it will continue, but in our children and grandchildren's lifetime, it will be abolished.
Just to comment on the Holocaust for a second, I believe you have expressed strong disagreement with Hannah Arendt's statement that Eichmann represents the banality of evil.
Oh, she's a fool. She was an absolute fool. First of all, she was a liar. She didn't go to the trial. She wasn't there. How do I know that? Because my mentor and close friend, Telford Taylor, was there every day. He didn't see her. She was not there. She came to Israel with a predisposition. She was a virulent anti-Zionist. As you know, she had an affair with Heidegger, who was a major Nazi. She hid that. She didn't mention that in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. She got it all completely wrong. The banality of evil is one of the worst phrases ever devised. The people who conducted the Holocaust were anything but banal. They were professors, they were philosophers, they were musicians, they were brilliant, brilliant people. And that's the great tragedy of the Shoah. That brilliance doesn't stop evil. The banality of evil seems to suggest that evil comes about through people not like Hannah Arendt and not like Heidegger and not like so many of the others who were brilliant PhDs who were instrumental. Remember, the students pushed Nazism. The students were the ones who got other students expelled from the schools. So Hannah Arendt has done a horrible, horrible disservice. You know, I debated Hannah Arendt in the last couple of years in her life, and she was just a damn fool. She had a philosophy of totalitarianism, but had no common sense, and she had no ability to really discern good from evil. For her, there was a kind of theoretical notion, and her books are still read. There are so many heroes. Gertrude Stein, she's still a hero of feminism. She was a Nazi collaborator. She lived freely in Nazi-occupied France with her friend and gave solace to the head of the Gestapo. She nominated Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize. She wrote an introduction to the works of leading Nazis. She, like so many others, Ezra Pound, intellectuals in the 1930s and 40s, fell into the enthrallment of Nazism. So banality of evil, you're going to tell me Gertrude Stein was banal? She was anything but banal. And there was so many other Nazis who were brilliant. So beware of oversimplifications of complex issues.
I mentioned my grandfather was murdered. They were Hungarian Jews. My grandmother survived carrying my mother as an infant through a concentration camp. I grew up with the Holocaust, just seeping out of the walls in our house. And so the idea of never again, the idea that the Holocaust could never be forgotten, it was just so ingrained in our family. How could it ever happen again? It happened. The world knows. with each passing year, it seems less and less likely that it could never happen again, or that something like it could never happen again.
First of all, it did happen again. It happened during the Pol Pot genocide in Cambodia. It happened in Darfur. It happened in other places, not to the extent of 6 million and creating death camps and marching 3-year-old children into gas chambers. That didn't happen. But I went to Cambodia and I saw the killing fields and saw the museums and understood that not only could it happen after 1945, it did happen after 1945 because the Nazis weren't punished. Germany wasn't punished. The Marshall Plan, one of the most immoral actions ever conducted by a civilized world, rewarded Nazism. You know, Hitler said, if we kill the Jews, the German people will be better off economically. He was right. They killed the Jews and the German people were better off economically. They thrived through the Marshall Plan, West Germany did. And people, SS people, put it on their resume. Jewish survivors had the numbers taken off because they were ashamed of being survivors, and the perpetrators, the SS people, put it on their resumes because almost nobody was punished. A very tiny percentage of people were symbolically tried at the Nuremberg trials. You know, a few handfuls were hanged. And then John McCloy, the anti-Semitic, horrible High Commissioner to Germany, who ran a law firm that discriminated against Jews, of course, married to a German woman, then acquitted all the others and let them free and gave them commutations. And all the leading Nazis under John McCloy went free, went back into business, and proceeded to make millions of dollars. Now, you want to hear something? They did a poll. What are the two most popular and highly thought of countries in the world today? Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan, the two countries that perpetrated some of the worst outrages and horrors in the Second World War. Now, you might say that shows tshuva is possible. Redemption is possible. It also shows that the reason it could happen again is the world has told people in Germany and Japan, don't worry, you won't be punished. A few of your leaders will be punished. There'll be some symbolic hangings, but the rest of you will go on with your lives and become very wealthy. That's what happened in Germany and Japan.
Just let that sit for a moment. It's powerful and sad. And to go even one step further, today we find Israel constantly having to defend its right to exist, and tragically, not only in the face of its obvious enemies, but even in the Jewish community. There are Jews who compare Israel to Nazis. It's a disaster in our community.
They're on college campuses. They're all over the place. Or even you see what's going on in Georgia today. There is a man running for the Senate, and if he wins, he will help the Democrats take control of the Senate. I'm a Democrat. I think that would be a good thing. But his name is the Reverend Warnock, and he has said, we saw, he said, talk about witnesses. We saw Israel gunning down unarmed Palestinian, our brothers and sisters, like wild birds of prey. This man is running for the Senate, and Jews are enthusiastically supporting him, saying he's the best candidate. I have an article this week in the Atlanta Jewish Times about him, and rabbis are lying about him. Rabbis are saying it's taken out of context. What he said was taken out of context. No, it wasn't taken out of context. You're taking it out of context, rabbis. You might want to say, vote for him anyway. That's fair. But don't tell me that it's taken out of context when he compares Israel to apartheid countries, when he says there are different rules for Jews and non-Jews in Israel, that the security wall had no purpose other than to confiscate Arab land. When you sign a declaration that never once mentioned terrorism or rockets or rocket tunnels, don't tell me that's out of context, rabbis. No, if you want to vote for him, fine. But tell your congregants the truth. What he said was virulently anti-Israel, borderline anti-Semitic, a blood libel. Now, if you think he's converted and become a good guy, all right, tell us that. Maybe we can believe it. But we don't believe you when you lie about what he said in the past and blame us for taking him out of context. No, we didn't take him out of context. You did.
Yeah, it was Israel, and the way that Israel is covered in the media that actually woke me up out of the stupor that I think I lived in all my life as a Jew growing up in New York and trusting the New York Times as the source of truth. I was in Jerusalem in 2014. I was there doing some interviews with some rabbis filming for a show. And Shlomo Katz, Rabbi Shlomo Katz, called me in the morning, said, we can't get together today. Something terrible has happened. This was about 30 minutes after the Har Nof massacre happened. For people who are not familiar, two terrorists broke into a synagogue during morning prayers on a weekday and literally massacred 4 rabbis during morning prayers with hatchets, blood everywhere. Thank God a policeman was walking by, not a Jewish policeman, by the way. I believe he was Druze. And he killed these terrorists.
But don't worry about the terrorist families. They're well taken care of. They're paid enormous bounties under Palestinian pay-to-slay policy. If you slay somebody, your family will be taken care of. You'll be paid. It's like the mafia. If you're a soldier in the mafia and you kill the opposing mafia leader and you're killed, don't worry, your family will be taken care of. The Palestinians have the same philosophy.
Well, yes. And half an hour later, literally half an hour later from when I got the news, the news started breaking, first in the BBC, and then the same headlines were picked up in the American press, like the New York Times. Israeli security forces kill 2 Palestinians. That was the headline. Now, when I saw that, and having just heard the news that when it happened, less than a mile from where I was standing, I said, if that's how this event is represented, what else? If I'm getting my information from a media that distorts to that degree, then what's really going on in the world? Because whatever my opinions are based on is not the truth. And it's since then that I don't believe anything that I read in one source. If I want to have a chance of knowing what's going on in the world, you have to read right, left, center, triangulate what the truth is from these biased sources.
Walter Cronkite couldn't get a job in the media today. We trusted Walter Cronkite, and legitimately, I got to know Walter near the end of his life. He spent summers on Martha's Vineyard, where I spent summers, and he was the most trusted American because he always called it straight. And you could get one source of news. You could watch CBS at 6:30 at night and believe what Walter Cronkite said. You can't do that anymore. There is no Walter Cronkite, and you have to read multiple sources. And even then, you really have to see for yourself. The theme of my article that I wrote in the Atlanta Jewish Times was think for yourself, Jews. Don't listen to the rabbis on the left. Don't listen to the rabbis on the right. Don't listen to the Democrats. Don't listen to the Republicans. Read for yourself what the Reverend Warnock has said. Read the statement that he signed. Listen to his sermon. Listen to his recent statements where he says he supports Israel. See if you think it's a convenient candidate's conversion or legitimate. Make up your own mind. That is the essence of being an American. Make up your own mind. It's the essence of being a Jew. Think for yourself. Think for yourself. Make your own decisions. Don't accept the words of others as gospel truth. That's what the Talmud is all about.
Yes.
Rambam didn't love the Talmud because the Talmud gave room for argumentation on all sides. He decided to write the Mishnah Torah. But, Rambam was the most brilliant failure in American in Jewish history. He thought he could write a catechism for the Jews like Christians have. And we say the catechism in the davening every day, Ani Ma'amin, or,
the 13 principles of faith.
Yeah, but how many Jews believe in those 13 principles of faith? I think I'm 4 for 13. I think some Jews are 6 for 13. I don't know very many Jews who are 13 for 13. We're not a religion of catechism. We're a religion of action, of skepticism, of doubt, of wonder, of open-mindedness. That's what the Talmud is all about, which is why I love the Talmud.
All right, so we're actually working our way through this Mishnah on how the judges would intimidate. It literally says intimidate the witnesses. And so the next paragraph is, so the proof for this, you should know that in a capital case, it's not like a monetary case. If you make the wrong decision, the defendant is going to be subject to the death penalty. So this is how important is your obligation. So the proof for this is as we found with Cain, who killed his brother Abel, as it is stated concerning him. The voice of your brother's blood, and it's actually bloods, deme, cries out to me from the ground. The verse does not state your brother's blood, dam, in the singular, but rather your brother's blood, deme, in the plural. This serves to teach that the loss of both his brother's blood and the blood of his brother's offspring are ascribed to Cain. The Mishnah notes, alternatively, the phrase your brother's blood is written in the plural teaches that this blood was not gathered in one place, but was splattered on the trees and the stones. Therefore, Adam, the first man, was created alone to teach you that with regard to anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, he kills one Jew, the verse ascribes to him blame as if he destroyed an entire world. As Adam was one person from whom the population of an entire world came forth. And conversely, anyone who sustains one soul from the Jewish people, anyone who saves a soul, a life, the verse ascribes to him as if he had saved the whole world.
I got a call yesterday from friends of the people who I helped to save. I got 2 commutations. I helped to get 2 commutations yesterday of 2 Jews who were serving life imprisonment. And the call I got quoted the Talmud that he who redeems a single Jewish human life as if they had saved the world. This it's part of a long tradition. And when we save a life as lawyers, we're not as fortunate as doctors who can save lives. Both of my grandchildren are in medical school, and they're going to save a lot of lives. As a lawyer, I can occasionally save a life. And when I save somebody from life imprisonment, I think that I've saved a life as well. So I accept. You want to know something interesting? The statement about it saves a human life is not only in the Talmud, it's also in the Sharia. It's in the Muslim variant on the Talmud, borrowed from the Jewish tradition. And it was quoted, I forget by which president, quoted it both from the Talmud and from the Sharia. And it's a wonderfully moving phrase. And we know, I spoke a few years ago to 1,000 German lawyers, not Jewish, German lawyers. There were probably 10 Jews in the audience, maybe. And I asked them, how many of you think of yourselves as victims of the Holocaust? And the few Jews raised their hands. And I said, no, you're all potential victims. How many of you have had family die of heart attack, stroke, diabetes, cancer? Every hand went up. How do you know that the cures for those diseases did not go up in the smoke of Auschwitz? You're all victims of the horrors of Nazism, because all these diseases could potentially have been cured. And when you think of one person killed in the gas chamber, how many offspring they would have had today? I have a friend, I think about that all the time. I have a close friend among my Chavrusa in Borough Park, the only person among our group who had only one child. He had a daughter, but the daughter had 5 children, and each of the daughter's children had 5 or 6 children. And now he's a great grandfather, my age, 82. He's a great grandfather. He is, with one child, probably had 40 or 50 descendants. And so obviously the concept of Demay, the concept of the bloods, is a brilliant, brilliant concept. And the thing about the Torah, I wrote a book called The Genesis of Justice, giving my midrash on the book of Genesis. I didn't come up with that one. But the book of Genesis, if I were alone on a desert island with my students and had one Amazon box that I could send for one book, it would be the Torah, because you can teach anything from that. You can teach literature, philosophy, science, you name it.
Music.
It's all there, a law, obviously. And so, we're so lucky to have the Torah and the Talmud as part of our heritage.
We are. And I mean, this phrase is so famous, but most people don't realize that it's witnesses being charged with their sacred obligation to be truthful in court, who are being told that if you kill one, etc. We might also note that there's no jury in this system, right? So the finders of fact and the deliberators are going to be the panel of judges. There is no jury.
Most countries don't have juries. The only country that really still has a jury is the United States. Now, England claims to have a jury, but mostly it's 12 chairs that are moved around by the judge. The judge charges the jury, and the jury has a much less important role in England than in the United States. There are juries, of course, in other places, semi-juries, partial juries, but the vast majority of countries now have moved away from the jury system and toward professional judges. We have the worst possible system when we elect our judges. State judges are elected, state prosecutors are elected. That gives them an incentive to pander to the public, and that's not what judges and prosecutors should do. So I think we can learn something. The Israeli system of picking judges, until very recently at least, has been among the best, and they have produced very, very excellent judges and justices of their Supreme Court.
Now, what about the jury system itself? Is that an advantage of the American system if we're somewhat alone in that, or is that a disadvantage?
It's both. It's uniquely American. It is a check and balance on the excesses of prosecution. You can't whisper to a jury. You can only say things to them that are a matter of record. And so if you ask me, is the jury system good and bad, good or bad? I'll say yes. It's good and it's bad. It makes a lot of mistakes. And but it's good because it serves as a protection, as a safeguard. It's part of our broad system of checks and balances.
This Mishnah that we're working our way through, it comments quickly that, you know, when we're talking about one life, if you take a life, all the descendants are included in that life. It also says what's amazing about God is that he creates everyone from a single man, from Adam, and yet they are all different. Unlike when we create coins from a single mold, they're all the same. And then it concludes, when the witnesses are charged that they have this sacred obligation and that they might be responsible for taking the lives of all these descendants of the defendant. Well, maybe the witness would say, you know what, I don't need it. I don't need that heavy burden that my testimony might be used to kill this guy and wipe out all his descendants. And so why would we want this trouble? Perhaps it would be better not to testify at all. But be aware, is it not already stated, and he being a witness, whether he has seen or known, if he does not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. That's from Leviticus 5:1. It is a transgression not to testify when one can do so. And perhaps he will say, well, why should we want to be responsible for the blood of this person? But be aware, as it is not already stated, Proverbs 11:10, when the wicked perish, there is song. Not only will you not be held to blame if you do your job and the guilty person is convicted, but that is something to celebrate.
No, I completely agree with that. And the Supreme Court has said that no person is above the law. Presidents have to testify. Everybody has to testify, and everybody should testify and should testify truthfully. And too few people do. And there's so much perjury that goes on in our legal system. It's a tragedy.
Our time is winding down. Nina, are you going to pass me some questions that might have come from the audience? I'll give people a chance to ask them.
Let me put to your audience an ethical dilemma that was put to me some years ago. A man is called in front of a jury in a capital case. He has strong moral objections to capital punishment. He's asked on the form, do you have strong moral objections to capital punishment? If he answers yes, he's excluded from the jury. He calls me and says, Professor Dershowitz, I have strong objections, and therefore I'm going to lie. I'm going to commit perjury. I'm going to say I don't have strong objections because I want to serve on that jury and save the man's life. I put my obligation to save his life over my obligation to tell the truth. What do you think? What do your viewers think? Let me tell you what I told him. He said, what should I do? And I said, you've already done it. He said, what do you mean? I said, you've already done it. You've called me. If you call me, you know I can only give you one answer as a lawyer. You cannot commit perjury. If you really wanted to commit perjury, you wouldn't have called me. You just would have done it. You didn't need advice to commit perjury. You wanted my advice, and I have to tell you, you just can't do it. I can't tell you to do it. I don't know what he ended up doing, but it's an interesting dilemma, and I put it to my students from time to time, and we get very split opinions.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the easy cases that make the law move forward. It's not the easy cases that you teach. I mean, the easy cases are easy cases. But I do remember the saying that tough cases make bad law. Because when we get caught up in the equity of really difficult situations, we're tempted to make a new legislation that in the more typical case is going to lead to travesties of justice.
I think Holmes overstated it. I think that often hard cases make bad law. Often they make good law. Often they don't make law at all. So be careful of pithy quotations and observations, whether by Churchill or Holmes, or by me or by you or anybody else, and always deconstruct every quotation and think about it for yourself. Don't say because Holmes said it, it must be right. Holmes made a lot of mistakes.
All right, we have a question from a young viewer. I think she's brilliant. It's my daughter, but she's been watching. So Molly Litvak in LA asks, Professor, do you have any advice for Zionists on college campuses? How can we change the situation when so many professors are anti-Israel?
Well, let me first start by saying that I give this advice. I speak to high schools all over the country, particularly Jewish high schools. Recently, I was banned and canceled by a Jewish high school after they invited me because of the false accusation. And they said to me, we know it's a false accusation, but basically it's controversial, so we don't want trouble. So those students were denied the opportunity to hear me express and tell people what they should do on college campus. So you've asked me, and I hope maybe some of the students from that school will be watching this. Let me tell you first what never to do. Never try to censor an opposing speaker. If somebody's coming on campus going to make virulently anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, even anti-Semitic statements, don't try to stop them. Try to get equal time. Use it as an educational moment. Use it as an opportunity to teach, but don't ever try to stop opposing speakers from speaking on campus. I think every Friday on your campus, you should produce a one-page, 2 sides of the page, very well done color brochure, one-page handout, what Israel has done for you this week. Just listing the technological, medical, scientific, musical, literary things that have come out of Israel this week that benefits you. Because no country in the history of the world has ever contributed more to humankind in 72 years of existence than Israel has in its first 72 years. So make that case on college campus. And remember, 10% won't listen. They're virulently anti-Israel. 10% don't have to listen because they're pro-Israel. It's the 80% in the middle. It's the 60 or 70% with open minds that you're appealing to. So work hard to appeal to that middle open-minded group. Great question. Thank you.
By the way, people are watching us from Italy, Tanzania, Miami, Israel, Arkansas, Pakistan, North Carolina, France, Puerto Rico, and many other places.
Apologize for my sore throat. I just sucking on a cough drop. So
no problem. And Lou Weiss says, Alan, it's great seeing you again, an old neighbor from Brooklyn and young Israel, now living in Modine.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
There was something else that I wanted to make sure. Well, we've talked about that. We've had a far-ranging conversation in the context of breaking down a Mishnah, but this is great. We've covered just about everything I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to give you an opportunity. First of all, I want to mention that you have your own podcast. Why don't we mention it now?
Called The Dersh Show. The only thing it's missing is the wits, and that's provided by the questions from the viewers. So call into The Dersh Show. It's on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes. It's on 5 days a week. It deals with a range of subjects, legal, political, Israel, the Middle East. So I'd love to have you as subscribers or as viewers or listeners. The Dersh Show.
Beautiful. And last thing is, I'd like to just ask you, could you take us through just like, if I say to you, what's your most memorable moment in court? What would that be?
My most memorable moment in court took place out of court. It was the freeing of Natan Sharansky. I had worked on Anatoly Sharansky's criminal case for 8 years, along with Erwin Cutler. We went to the Soviet Union. We filed briefs. We filed resolutions in Congress. We had debates on television. We worked endlessly on Sharansky's behalf. And his wife pleaded with me, please get him out in time for me to have babies. And he got out when he was about 39, and so was she, and immediately had 2 little girls who are now mothers. And to me, that was the most gratifying. And of course, I was once asked on television what the biggest fee I ever earned. And I said, Sharansky. They said, well, oh, we didn't know he was rich. I said, no, he didn't have a penny. It was all pro bono. But when he got out, when he crossed the Galactic Bridge, and I met him for the first time in person, and he whispered in my ear, Baruch Matir Asurim. Blessed are those who free the imprisoned, comes from the Shemona Esrei every day. The tears that flew out of my eyes and his, it was the biggest fee I will ever earn in any case. So that was my happiest moment as a lawyer. I had a pretty happy moment yesterday when I spoke to President Trump and got the news that he was going to be commuting the sentence of 2 men who were going to die in prison. And I helped persuade the president that these 2 men deserve commutation. And so when I found out that he was going to commute them, and when they were set free, that was a great moment in my life. Of course, saving the lives of the 2 boys on death row, saving the lives of other people. I've had, I think, 26 or 27 homicide cases, and I've won, I think, 23, and I'm still aiming to win the 24th. So I've had a very good record in homicide cases. And so I have saved some lives, and I'm very, very, I'm proud of that accomplishment. I wish I could have saved more.
I mean, that's a lot of inspiration. We talk about Natan Sharansky's case. It's one thing to say, oh, you're going to take a really tough case and take it all the way to the American Supreme Court, but to go into the Soviet Union, where seemingly it's all ruled by, just totalitarian dictators who care nothing about the rule of law, and come out of there with a legal victory, it must have seemed impossible at the outset.
Well, only a legal victory. It was a legal, political, diplomatic, economic victory. We didn't fool ourselves thinking that our legal arguments alone could persuade the court. We had to give the court cover in our legal arguments. But in the end, we arranged a spy exchange. I spent Thanksgiving of 19, whatever it was, in partly in in Germany and partly in France, negotiating with Wolfgang Vogel, whom some of you may remember from Bridge of Spies. He was the trader, and I worked with him and helped effectuate that trade. But we used everything. We used congressional laws, sanctions, economic sanctions, political, everything. And in the end, too little, too late, but we got him out in a timely fashion. He should have gotten out immediately. He didn't do anything wrong. And so it was very gratifying. But you have to know, if you're a lawyer, that the law doesn't operate in a vacuum. You have to know how to use other forms of persuasion.
That's for sure. I mean, I heard the story from Gary Apfel about arranging Shlomo Roboshkin's release.
Well, Gary is one of the greatest lawyers and one of the biggest mensches around. He's a phenomenal guy. I think of him as my partner. We work together for Aleph. He does all of his work, I think, pro bono. I do 50% of my work pro bono, most of it now for Aleph. And we work together. And Gary never sleeps. He had COVID recently. He just worked through it, and he just doesn't give up. He's just a walking mitzvah man. That's what he does in life. And it's such
I will definitely send this clip over to him after our show. Well, Professor Dershowitz, I really want to thank you for appearing on AT Live today and sharing your stories, your views, your inspiration. It's not tilting at windmills to take on big legal battles that are, as you say, not just legal, but using all tools at our disposal to make sure justice happens. You've made a career of that, and we honor you and we thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and keep your wonderful podcast going, and may many people listen to you and learn from you.
Amen. Amen. All the best. I'm going to end the broadcast now.